Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining me today. Um, Today I'm going to be talking more about opinions and kind of going into how that is triggering. So, when typically and when there is a set of derivatives that is binary, there's typically on average going to be two derivatives and or options, air quote, that one can choose from at any given time. This is where the standardized idealism comes into play. This is where the pedestals are. This is where the roller coaster comes in from highs to lows. And today I'm going to be discussing that a little bit further. So, when it comes to breaking down the binary way of thinking, typically on average, there are two ways that you can go about things. We have good and we have bad. Okay? Now, associated directly to and typically on average where the systems of function come into play, this is where the other set that would hold up the corners of the table would come into play. So we have right and we have wrong. Now, if I were to ask you, what is it exactly of those four examples, do any of them seem to correlate and directly with one another? So do they line up? Do they match? Are they the same? Do they seem equal? And so on. And if that's the case, would this be an example of one of the things that would come up? You have good and bad on a spectrum, and you have right directly under good on another spectrum separate from the first, where on the other side would be wrong, directly correlating with bad. So these, if that's the case, if this is the example that we're going to use, binary thinking, okay? One of the things that's really interesting about this is the fact that it is, in fact, this is where gaslighting comes into play for me, where I get really confused about things. Because in correlation to fact, in lieu of fact, this is, if this is the standardized example, then yes, this is true. They are, in fact, parallel to each other. Now, where things get interesting is when you have a person's opinion that is more, when a person feels entitled to be right. The direct association they have from the validation and supply they get is good. Okay? So then, in extreme, if they are not receiving what they have received before as good, then something must be bad. One of the things that I've been trying to dance around with and kind of blend with is, because that's one way, that is correct, that is one way of thinking about it. Now I'm going to ask you another way, or in my case, perception. You see, there is, when it comes to my opinion, there is perceiving and there's perception. Perceiving is how I view and interact with the world around me. How I perceive things is how I feel. If I'm around a person that just, I've been around people before who just make me feel at ease. They're just easy to be around. You know, they're good people, they're fun. It's one of those people you can just sit with and just sit and not say anything. It's just like, I'm just gonna sit here and decompress, and I apologize if my sighing or heavy breathing and occasional crying upsets the quiet, but I you know, at the same time, they're that person who's like, okay, well, dinner is going to be at 5:30, and you sit there and ask, well, is there anything that you want me to bring? And I was going to make green beans. Oh, well, I know how to make some I know a recipe. If it helps, I can take that load off your shoulders. I would really love to volunteer for that position. Green beans. Dinner at 5:30. That kind of feeling when you're around that kind of person, for me, is, it's interesting how it is a triggering effect, just as it would be being around somebody who is initially harmful and or abusive. These are physiological responses, and the reason why they are called triggers, why I refer to them personally as triggers, is because there are, in fact, physiological signs, symptomatically speaking. There are sensations. There are changes in repetition and not only consistency but pattern and routine based on an overall state of homeostasis. Spidey senses go off. Gut reaction is nausea. Like, it's like, I don't feel good. Like, you make me feel like a bad person. Like, I just feel like I need to go be around a wire brush and scalding water with bleach and lemon juice after being around you. And it's been 3.5 seconds past 0, which is going on 4 seconds too long. Versus, I can't believe it's already been like, we met up at 10 o'clock in the morning and it's dinner time now? Like, that's insane. I didn't even know. So in regards to, I know, I don't remember all of the people who are directly responsible, and I sincerely apologize. I will re-reference and then update later on this video. There are 4 sympathetic responses. So like an autonomic response, and then there's a parasympathetic response. And so this parasympathetic response would be stuff that would be, I may be getting these backwards, but would be the offensive measures. So offensive measures offset the defensive measures, which are the automatic responses, and that's why they're autonomic. That's why, to an extent, it's autonomic. So autonomic responses would be things like, out of the 4, it's equal. So out of the 4 would be the 2, and that would be the first one would be fight. And then once fight starts to, you can only fight for so long. That's adrenaline, that's like excessive amounts of adrenaline, for example. It's fight, you're gonna fight. This is also where gut responses come into play for me. It's like, ooh, there's a knot in my belly where normally there would be ease or butterflies. And now there's a rock. Oh. So, fight response. Also, then if fight only stays on for so long, then once that starts to lower down, if the alert is still present, then kicks over to possibly funny. And in extreme measures, that is where you go. So it would go from aggressor response. These would be defensive measures, so they're aggressors. So defensive measure fight would be rage. Defensive measure fawn would be appeasing. Defensive measure for fight would be arousal. Defensive measure for fawn would be adulation. And then when you have the flight, flight and freeze response, those are offensive measures. So when defensive measures kick into a certain point, it triggers a response then into your body, which then offsets the offensive measure to see if it can calm down the situation in your body. And then if that doesn't work, then it kicks into the next measure, which would be the emergency backup per se. It's like having a Duralast car battery versus having a Generac generator. Both are able to import and export energy and electrical in the sense of electricity per se, but yet the differences are inexplicably. One is disposable. It only has so much go in it, and then it's no good anymore. One is only used, and that's to be expected with regular use. It's disposed after regular use, which is consistent. One is there to kick in when emergency systems start to get to a certain low and the functions are starting, they have gotten rid of everything they can and they're now running at a basic minimum. And once that measure gets to a certain low, it kicks in and then boosts and then supplies what is needed till that original system regenerates to its original onset, so then it can actually take over where it was in the first place in doing this job. And then you have some that they are then there are some that are rechargeable, for example. Those ones are able to store a certain amount of energy, go through the energy, restore the energy. So, different ways. Going back to a different way of thinking. Triggers. What if I were to tell you, is this equal? Is this the same? These are just, it's food for thought. It's just food for thought. This is just stuff that I have kind of gone through myself, and I'm wondering if there's any measures, because if this is the case where it is set up right and wrong on one spectrum, good and bad on another spectrum, but instead of the lines running parallel, they are adjacent and they run perpendicular to one another, so there's a crossing point. So it creates a crossroads where there are 4 quadrants. And if that's the case, is this a closer diagram to what gray area would be? So would this be phasing? And this be closer to a trend? There's still room for gray area. Okay. Now, adding a little more spice. First we salt, then we pepper, and now we're going with some onion powder. There we go, kids. Now, we're adding in another area on another spectrum. Positive and negative. This would be consequential. Right and wrong would be areas, all of which are consequential, but right and wrong are areas of choice that you have a little bit more. If one moderates in a disciplinary fashion, has more quote-unquote control per se over their own choices, which then determines their actions, which then has a direct result, or may not have a direct result on the actual outcome. But inexplicably, you do have a say. So, when it comes to good and bad, right and wrong would be choices. Good and bad are inevitabilities. There are some things that are just good. There are some things that are just bad. If you stub your toe and it hurts, and you stub your toe really hard and it hurts, that's bad. If you get mad at somebody and punch their face in, that's bad, but still hurt, but for different reasons. At that point in time, it's intention. That's where things get a little bit tricky. And that's kind of where positive and negative come into play. This is the consequences. This is the affect. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you again, kind of, if we go back to the original onsets. One spectrum, good, bad. One spectrum, right, wrong. In parallel, it is, in fact, even. As a crossroad, there's a point that it all lines up, that it matches. Unless you have unless there is a direct path, unless there's a way that is direct, that you can associate and connect the 2 points, then it is not, in fact. It's just an option, again, on the spectrum. So if you have a parallel, in fact, to a degree, it has to line up the entire way through. On a crossroad, though, not necessarily. There are points in which they line up. Okay. Now, adding in positive to good and bad. Now, where would equal or even be? All things said, removed. All things said, removed, just your personal opinion. There is no, the thing that's nice about a personal opinion is for yourself and what it does for you, there isn't necessarily a wrong or a right. What you do with it and how others, and how you interact with others and how that integrates may have an effect that may be positive and negative. And in some variations, in some instances, unfortunately, when things are characterized as more unhealthy, harmful, and even in some instances dangerous. That's not the case. Going back. So, is this even? If I have wrong and right running on a parallel and adjacent, I have good and bad on one side, and then on another point, positive and negative. Does it matter which is in front, good and bad on a spectrum separate from positive and negative? Does it matter? Does it make a difference? I have a lot of questions because typically on average, I have a lot of racing thoughts. This comes from the ADD. Now, when I was younger, I had a significant amount of racing thoughts. It was odd. One of the things about thoughts is you can have a thought that you think about, and then you can think about certain thoughts. But the act of thinking is just as eccentric as the act of remembering, as memory. Memories are only as good as the last time you recalled a memory versus the actual memory itself. Now, this is where traumas are interesting, because if something is impactful, and the way the human brains are designed is to retain negative easier and more readily automatic, that's just default, honey. That's love. That's just a default. That is not who you are. We can all make a difference, but you have to do it yourself. So going back to the tangents. So now in this instance, you would have right, and then you would have good, and you'd have positive, and then you'd have wrong, and you'd have negative and bad, right. Now, if this is the case, it is actually in fact kind of like a circle. Everything evens out. So it seems, but it's actually off balance, because this is my thing, is that what if this is actually off balance? What if the case is more over right, good, negative, wrong, positive, bad? Because then you have correlating factors that even each other out. Just food for thought. If you were to just flip one, what if instead of good and bad and good and positive being on the top, you have bad and positive on the top? What if on the top you have bad and negative? So, about the racing thoughts. I would have a lot of different questions, and one of the issues that I came across was the adults that were around me didn't seem to necessarily have the answers available. And when there were questions that I would ask, it would come across as a good question. And in their reference and their opinions, it was smart. You know, one of the interesting things about some of these, when I'm going to ask a couple of, I'm going to throw out a couple of different words. And this is food for thought. When I say smart, on the spectrum of right and wrong, where does that fall? When I mention the same word using good and bad, smart, on a spectrum of good and bad, where does smart fall into play? When I use the word pretty, when I use the word cigarette smoker, when I use the word mother, on the spectrum of good and bad and the spectrum of right and wrong, where do these things lie? Now, for the examples today and the words that we've used and the correlating charts that have been integrated, that's a lot to process. That is how I break down the thoughts and the opinions that I get from them when it comes to feelings that arise. Thank you for letting me share, and if you do, in fact, have any thoughts or opinions, I would value them. I am new at this, actually. There was a reminder, I suppose one could say, that the comments may be restricted, age for kids, and no to viewers over 21, no to viewers under 18, yes to viewers under 18. Playing around with getting the channel associated, but then again, I'm essentially just trying to just be me. Everybody needs a job, but it was a nice reminder. Thank you, Matthews. Yeah. All right, kids. Thank you kindly for going through this today with me, and with my most sincere and humblest gratitude. Thank you very much for being here with me. I wish you all well, safe journeys, and to the madams and sirs, excuse me, to the madams and sirs, I wish you a good day, and I wish you many luck, and a fulfilling future. With all my heart. Good day, and good good eve to you. Thank you.